Welcome back, everyone. I have been waiting about a month and a half to say that, and I'm so happy to be back. So thank you so much for all your patience and for sticking with me in this very interesting adventure that we're on. And if you're wondering, if you're watching this, a year from now when this was uploaded, thinking, where did he go? What was going on? I had a bit of a hiatus out in the real world, apart from YouTube and Facebook, and they've been taken care of, and everything is good, so we're good to go, and we're making PowerPoints again. We are doing the studying, we're doing the lecturing, and so thank you for having me back and inviting me into your computer. Anyways, today what we are talking about are the Tannaitic texts and the Tannaim. I think that's the only presentation where we have a quadruple alliteration in the title, unless we include the word title, and it's, I guess, 5. Anyways, so what this is dealing with, we're going to be talking about the Mishnah, the Tosefta, the Midrashim, and the sages of Judaism. That's our subtitle for today. Now you're thinking, John, what does this all mean? I need to know. We have the answers for this. Well, we're going to be explaining this. The Mishnah, Tosefta, and the Midrashim are texts and the sages of ancient Israel, otherwise known as Chazal, C-H-A-Z-A-L. These are the rabbis that were determining the halacha, which we'll be reviewing a little bit. And they are basically the people that are commenting in the Mishnah and that are leading the people of Israel at this time. So here are our sources. Again, I like to, I've started including the page numbers just in case anybody has these books and they want to either double check me or learn more, get some more details on this, because, as you can see, we have, for our first book, we have almost 30 pages, and for our second book we have almost 30 pages, and so that's 60 pages of information, in addition to some other kind of general insights from Lawrence Schiffman's other book, Text and Tradition. And we're greatly summarizing this information. If we were to read all this, it'd probably take us a few hours. But anyways, here's our references, and we're going to be getting right into our outline today. We're first going to be looking at some historical background. We're looking at the aftermath of the revolt, or the you might call the Revolutionary War, of Bar Kokhba, who was termed Bar Kokhba, if you remember, but not only by Rabbi Akiva, who was one of the biggest rabbis at the time, a very respectable guy, but he happened to be wrong on this one issue about a guy named Bar Kokhba, who in the 130s, if you remember from either last time or the time before, that people thought that he was going to be Mashiach, and so they nicknamed him, instead of Bar Kokhba, they called him Bar Kokhba, which means son of the star, which is a messianic prophecy from, I think, Genesis 49 or something like that. But it's a prophecy that a star will arise, and this is attributed to Messiah, and so that they gave him this nickname. So we're going to be looking at the aftermath of what happened after the year 135. So the war is over, the Romans come in, they just annihilate Bar Kokhba's armies, or more properly Bar Kokhba's armies, because as Nazarenes we don't think that this guy Bar Kokhba was Mashiach, right? We think, and we believe, and we hold that this is a title reserved for Rabbeinu himself, Rabbeinu Yeshua of Nazareth, and so, as such, this is just me personally, I prefer to call him Bar Kokhba, and this is actually his name, but you'll more commonly see him called Bar Kokhba after his nickname. Anyway, so we'll be looking at what happened between the year 135 and the year roughly 200. So, just kind of to give you a time from there. We'll be doing a little bit of review today, just to contextualize some of this information. We'll be quickly reviewing what is halacha. What is halacha? What does the word Sanhedrin mean? We'll be looking at, and we'll be reviewing that a little bit. And then we're going to be looking at who are the Tanaim? And what do they do? What are they for? What does the word Tana even mean? Where does it come from? And secondly, we'll be looking at what is the Mishnah? And we'll, after that, be looking at what is the Tosefta? And after that, we'll be looking at what are the Midrashim? And what does this word even mean? So starting us off, we're going to be looking at some historical background, and where we're starting is in the mid-100s. We find ourselves in the 130s after the failed revolt, you could say semi-failed revolt, of Bar Kokhba. And I say semi-failed simply because he did have a number of successes, and that's why people thought, hey, this guy could actually be Mashiach. He did establish an independent kingdom of Judea for a few years, and they minted their own currency, they had their own armies, and so he did have a number of successes that benefited the Jewish people. Unfortunately, however, this was crushed, and the rest is history. No pun intended. But after, beginning in the 130s, and after that time, we find this guy named Hadrian, which some of you might have heard of if you're familiar with Roman history, or maybe even British history. Hadrian was the emperor of Rome, and he begins persecution of Jews after the revolt of Shimon Bar Kokhba. And so, what does this involve? First of all, there's a ban on proselytism, which the word proselytism just means the way of, or the making of, proselytes, right? And what's a proselyte? Proselyte is a convert. So basically, a ban on proselytism is a ban on converting people, in this case, specifically to Judaism. And this means that there's a ban on people converting to Judaism, which this was never actually looked highly on, right? It was never looked on very favorably. But now there's an outright ban. If you do it, you're done, right? And so this not only includes converts to Judaism, but this would also have probably included Noahides, because, you know, if it looks and smells and feels Jewish, it must be Jewish, right? And it has some effect on Christians, because people still think that Christianity has this connection with Judaism, and to a certain degree it does. It's complicated. We covered in one of our previous lectures on the parting of the ways, we found that the parting of the ways was not some kind of one-time event where, you know, everybody got together and like, hey, let's perform the parting of the ways, right? This is just an academic term that's ascribed to an evolution in mostly the 2nd century, the 100s, but also beyond that. And it's debated even, how long did it last? You know, did it just last in the 200s? I'm sorry, the 100s, the 2nd century? Did it go into the 200s, the 3rd century? Did it go beyond that? And if it went beyond that, then when did it stop? And so there's some debate as to the extent of which the Christians would have been included in this, but we know that they would have to some degree. And what that degree is, it's indeterminable. There's also a ban on circumcision, which is part of conversion. It's part of proselytism. But it also includes Jews circumcising their own Jewish children. And so it kind of harkens back to the events of the Maccabean War, where Antiochus IV, who fancied himself Epiphanes, God in the flesh, he bans some of these same practices like circumcision. And so the Jews are like, you know, we've been there, done that. We know what's going on. Things are not looking very good. And Hadrian goes on to eventually ban other mitzvot, other commandments, such as the reading of the Torah in public and the ban of granting shmicha. Well, what's smicha? It's basically rabbi ordination, the ordaining of rabbis to officially be rabbis, and not just, you know, hey, you know, I woke up and I want to be a rabbi today. I'm gonna, you know, get some business cards and start advertising. No, you had to go through a formal ordination process And that process was called smicha. And so basically, when you were ordained, when you were shmichad, another rabbi would lay their hands on you, and they'd be transferring the authority that had been passed down all the way from Sinai. And I believe it's from Numbers 11 that we'll be covering this in just a few minutes, so if I'm mistaken, we'll see. But the Holy Spirit was actually given to the sages of Israel. It says this right in the text. And this was believed to have been passed down. And so by laying hands on these new rabbinic initiates, these people who passed their rabbi ordination, they're passing on the Holy Spirit to them. This is what they believed. And there is actually quite a bit of biblical evidence to suggest that they were correct. It might have not been 100% of the time, but it was probably more true than not true. And so there's a really interesting passage in History of the Jewish People, which is a great book put out by Art Scroll. This is From Yavne to Pumbedisa, 9 centuries from destruction of the Second Temple to the end of the Gaonic period. And there's this story about this ordination and this shmicha. And I just wanted to read it to you. It's found in the Talmud's tractate Sanhedrin 13b to 14a. So it says, Rabbi Yehuda said in the name of Rav, "May this man be remembered for good." Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava is his name. For it once happened that the evil kingdom, this is speaking of Rome, it once happened that the evil kingdom passed a decree against Israel that whoever gave shmicha would be killed, and whoever received it would be killed. And the city in which the shmicha was conferred would be destroyed. So, you go to New York and people are being ordained in New York City. The city is going to be leveled. They're going to nuke it. This is basically, in modern parlance, what this is referring to. Somebody's being ordained in London. They're nuking the city. Somebody is being ordained in Berlin. They're nuking the city. This is basically the kind of fear and the kind of threat that they were facing at that time. Now, of course, they didn't have nuclear weapons back in those days, but they would destroy the city, rip it up, tear it down to the ground. And the city in which the smicha was conferred would be destroyed, and the area within the Sabbath boundaries, you remember from Acts it talks about the Sabbath day's journey, this is what this is talking about, the area within the Sabbath's boundaries where the smicha was conferred would be uprooted. What did Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava do? Because you have to continue training people. It's not like you just give up. He went and placed himself between 2 great mountains, between 2 great cities, and between 2 Sabbath days' boundaries, so that if you were caught, no inhabited place would be destroyed. Do you see what he's doing? He's going out in the wilderness, kind of like John the Baptist, Yochanan the Immerser, and he's doing covert shmicha. He's doing covert ordination so that nobody's going to be hurt. He has to be very strategic about this. He went between Sepharam and Usha, which the Sanhedrin was located at Usha for a little bit. There he granted shmicha to 5 elders, Rabbi Meir, Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Shimon, Rabbi Yosei, Rabbi Elazar ben Shammua, and then in parentheses it says, Rabbi Awiya adds Rabbi Nehemiah to the list. So there's a little bit of a difference of the passing of that down. When their enemies discovered them, Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava said to them, "My sons, flee!" And they replied, "Rabbi, what will become of you?" He answered them, "Behold, I will remain here in their way like a rock that cannot be overturned." And it is said that the Romans did not leave until they had driven 300 iron spears into him, making him like a sieve. In modern parlance, this is saying they shot him up so bad he turned into Swiss cheese. This is the kind of persecution that was going on. They drove 300 spears. That's basically like saying, hey, walk in front of this machine gun. In fact, it would have been worse because spears are bigger. They're more dull. You get shot once, you can die. You get stabbed, that's a slow, painful death. Why do you think they use crucifixion? Why do you think that they would nail your body to a tree? And they did this to tens of thousands of Jews. Because it's horrifying. Because it's psychological warfare. They want to send such a great message, a big message, that you will never go against their wishes again. But this honorable and pious and righteous Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava, was doing everything that he possibly could to continue the transferring from one generation to the next Torah knowledge, the knowledge of God, because in the Messianic era, that will be widespread. And if it's forgotten, there's not going to be any Messianic era. So in a certain sense, he's doing this with a Messianic hope, and he's doing this for the love of God. And so, when people are putting their lives on the line, hopefully this kind of gives you a picture of how terrible things were. And so we find, returning to our PowerPoint, we find that there was the graphic torture, and this is just one example, by the way. There's the graphic torture, just inhuman, animalistic, as somebody that I know would say, this caveman mentality of just you're wild and uncontrolled. There's this graphic torture and mutilation of Jews that are shomer mitzvot. They're Torah observant Jews. They're hunted down and kidnapped and crucified. They're burned alive. There's another example where they take reeds from the river, they shove them under their fingernails, and they bleed to death. And actually, this, with my education in history, this reminds me of an example of, I think, what happened in the Vietnam War, where the Viet Cong would take like bamboo shoots. They would put them under the fingernails of American soldiers and then add water. Then they would expand and it would ply off the fingernails. And it's a terrible, terrible torture. And that's not to comment on anything else about the war, but it is to say that this is something that has been used throughout history. And so we find that Rabbi Akiva is one of these huge Torah sages that is kidnapped by the Romans and basically assassinated, along with 9 other people, 9 other rabbis. And this is not all within a few days or weeks. This is over the course of some years. But these rabbis are collectively called the 10 Martyrs. And at a certain time of the year, they are recited. I believe it's on Yom Kippur. And what's interesting is that commentaries on the story of the 10 Martyrs describes them like sacrifices, which then kind of brings to mind the kidnapping and assassination of our own Rabbi Yeshua of Nazareth. And then we find during this time that rabbinic authority shifts from the land of Israel to Babylonia, where there was also a very large Jewish presence. Because when all the sages in Israel are dying, you still need someone to fill in the breach, right? When nobody either is or can rise to the occasion, either because they don't want to or because they can't because they're getting killed, you need someone to be brave and to take a stand and to help lead the people so that they don't go nuts, they don't apostatize, so that they have guidance, so that they don't fear, so that they keep their faith. And so this emphasis kind of shifts to the Jews living in Babylonia, which is also why we'll be talking about later. There are two Talmuds, which many of you probably didn't know that, but there are. There's the Yerushalmi Talmud, the Talmud of Jerusalem, which is probably more accurately the Talmud of the land of Israel. They wouldn't have been allowed to go into the actual city of Jerusalem. And then there's Talmud Bavli, which is the version of the Talmud that was made in the land of Babylonia. But we're getting ahead of ourselves now. There's also the consolidation of Jewish sages and the population into Galilee, which I don't even need to go into the significance of Galilee by now, right? We know that this was where the Zealots got started. We know that this is where Yeshua and the apostles were originally from. We know that Shemaiah and Avtalion, the kind of the mentors, the teachers of Hillel, these guys were there. They were buried there. And we also had prophets that were buried there. This is a big place. This is a very important place. And so we find that the Sanhedrin actually relocates to Galilee. I think that we covered this in a previous time. And we find the eventual establishment of yeshivot. What are yeshivot? They are basically academies or schools. And in these yeshivot, one rabbi is kind of the leader over the school, and you learn Torah from that rabbi. You learn their Torah, so to speak. And so, if they have a certain legal opinion, then you will learn their legal opinion, and that becomes your view, because that's the school of thought that you subscribe to. And so, you start seeing these different schools. Like formerly we saw Beis Hillel, Beis Shammai, which is House of Hillel, House of Shammai. You start seeing these similar schools of thought arising during this period because you have the establishment of these yeshivos. Also, there's this call of the rabbis for Jews of Judea to move north, especially to Galilee. This doesn't mean that everybody moved to Galilee. It just means, some people did. Some people couldn't afford it. Some people had too strong ties in their area. Some people just didn't want to, right? There's always multiple reasons for people's motives. But they were calling Jews to come to Galilee, especially Galilee, or at least closer to Galilee, because that was basically rabbinic HQ. And what that means is that because the Sanhedrin was located there, you had all of these yeshivas established there, and if you wanted to be a Torah-educated person, you're going to go to Galilee, right? You're not going to go be in the destroyed backwoods of the former land of Israel, right? And I say former simply because it was destroyed by Rome. Not permanently, but, temporarily. And so there was this call to come into Galilee. And what's really neat, I actually found this map just a few minutes before we started the lecture, and I thought it was so good that I'd replace my former map with the one that I found in History of the Jewish People. And so what we find here, I don't know if you can read it real well, but this is the land of Israel, and we find all of these gray blotches here, these spots. These are where Jews lived in and around the land of Israel. And so we find that down in Judea, which is the southernmost big blotch down there, that's going to be where much of the Jews lived. It's not necessarily indicating population density, but it is saying that's how far they were spread. Basically, it's the height and width of the land, not the density of the land. And so, as you can see, within the red circle is this little city named Aelia Capitolina. And Aelia Capitolina is the renamed Jerusalem. If you remember, during the wars, Rome came in and renamed the city of Jerusalem to Aelia Capitolina, which is, Jerusalem essentially became a pagan city at this point. The Jews were expelled, and as you can see, for miles around the city, there's no Jews. Because if you are found near the city of Jerusalem, you'd be executed. They would pick you off, possibly right where they found you. And this was not a very attractive option, naturally, to most Jews, and so they fled to other parts of the country. And some went south, some went east, some went west, some went north, and so the rabbis eventually said, let's all congregate in the north, and some Jews did that. Now, the arrows that you see, I added those in just to kind of show you where kind of the movement of these people. It doesn't mean that everybody left. It doesn't actually mean that that's the path that they took. It's just to mean it's a symbol. It's symbolic of people moving into Galilee. Now, who is this chap on the left? This is a actual photograph of a bust of Emperor Hadrian. As you know, there's no photography back then, but we know this is a bust of him. It's a statue of him. I think that's actually more correct, a statue rather than a bust. But this is probably something that he looked like. He looked something like this. And he was responsible for these persecutions against the Jews. Now, in this next slide, just a little bit of information about Emperor Hadrian. Not that it's real important, but again, just to give us some context. That on the upper right-hand corner is actually a bust. A bust is, remember, just the head, and sometimes it'll include the shoulders. This is a bust of Emperor Hadrian, and I can't quite tell if he's got a mustache. It looks kind of like he does. That might have been in his younger days. But this is actually a bust that they found in the River Thames, which, if you're familiar with British geography, the River of Thames, I believe, goes right through the city of London and empties out into the British Channel. And they found this head in the channel. And so, in the river, I mean. And so, basically, what Hadrian is sometimes most famous for is not only his Hadrianic persecutions, but also for this big wall stretching across the entire island of England, which, or I guess technically at this point it'd be called Britannia. So the Isle of Britain, he builds this wall to keep out the ferocious plaid of the Scots, right? The Scots were in the north, and the what do you call them? The Roman or the Latinized Anglo-Celtic people, I guess they were. The Britons were living in the south, and the Scots were living in the north, and the Scots would come down and hassle the Britons living in the south, and so Hadrian built this wall, and I'm not exactly sure how tall it is. From pictures, it looked like it was maybe 8 feet. So it's not real big. It's nothing like the Great Wall of China, although I'm sure that if Hadrian could import that, it'd be not only a monumental feat, but it'd also be one of the first occurrences of buying products from China. And unfortunately, these would actually last, whereas the modern typically don't. But anyways, so we see on the left, first of all, this is a picture of the Roman Empire under Hadrian in the year of the beginning of his reign, the year 117. And as we can see, his reign ends in the year 138, which means that he died a few years after he squashed the revolt in Eretz Yisrael. He crushed Bar Kosiba, and the land of Israel basically becomes a pagan land with a few regions of Jewish settlements. And so on the left, we see kind of a zoomed-in picture of the British Isle, and you can see that first one going across the island is Hadrian's Wall. There's another one called the Antonine Wall, which was built by his the emperor that came after him, Antoninus, and he builds this wall across the British Isle to keep the Scots out, and this is kind of what he's famous for. So not only was he a military man, he was an emperor, but he was also a builder, and this is also partly why Scotland and England look the way they do today, and why they're not all one people, and why even till today, I think it was even 2015 or 2016, where the Scots voted for independence from England. So they wanted to leave. But so this goes back a very long time, 2,000 years, really even more than 2,000 years. And you can see kind of a tiny picture of the wall up there. If you want, go and look it up on Google. We're not going to spend a whole lot of time on this. Anyways, so returning back to our historical background, back to the mid-100s, we find that a similar fate as Alexander the Great befalls Hadrian after all of his hate. And yes, I tried to rhyme there. Anyways, so on June 10th, 138, Hadrian catches a cold and dies. He falls ill, he has severe pains, and he just folds over and dies. And this is kind of similar, if you remember, to Alexander the Great, where he basically conquers the known world, except parts of India and China, obviously. He conquers much of the known world, and he returns to his palace in, I believe it's Babylon, and he catches a cold and dies at the tender age of 33. Now, Hadrian was not 33. I think he was a little bit older. But a similar fate befalls him. And after him, we find that this guy named Antoninus Pius, which if it looks like Anthony the Pious, you would be right, and your Latin would be proficient. And so we find that he begins his reign in 138, and he goes until 161. So he has actually a fairly long reign, about 42, 43 years, depending on part of the year that he died. And he's considered a good guy, generally. He's called one of the 5 good emperors, and this is kind of a technical term that describes 5 emperors from around this time in Roman history. They weren't maniacs, they weren't sadistic, they weren't mentally insane like Nero or Caligula, right? These guys are crazy. Antoninus Pius was not only a respectable guy, from what we can tell, by Roman standards at least, not only a somewhat respectable guy, he didn't go out trying to kill people and persecute people, and he didn't, he was not this strong-armed guy that says, follow me or I kill you. He was more of a philosophical guy. Now, the emperor that came after him, Marcus Aurelius, he was also more of a philosopher. So we see that a little bit of a change happening to the emperors here. Anyways, so Antoninus Pius, he relaxed persecution of Jews. In fact, there's a story of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, who is credited with writing the Zohar, and Rabbi Eliezer ben Rabbi Yossi, who they go to Rome. And actually, I'm just going to read the story here. In the text of History of the Jewish People, it says, the Talmud in Meila 17a through b relates how Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, accompanied by Rabbi Eliezer ben Rabbi Yossi, traveled to Rome, and how he succeeded in curing the sick daughter of the emperor. Curing the daughter of a Roman, where does that sound familiar from? Believed another rabbi did that about 100 years before him. In gratitude, the emperor took the 2 sages to his treasury and archives, telling them to choose whatever they wished to take away with them. There they found what they were looking for. Not diamonds or gold, but the document containing the old anti-Jewish laws. And this is the anti-Jewish laws not only passed by Hadrian, but also, I believe, by other emperors as well. They removed the document, tore it up, and thus assured the final annulment of those laws. Because remember, folks, a law was not a law simply because the government passed it. It was a law because it was written by someone in authority, and for it to be written by somebody in authority, it had to be written, right? There's no computer database. So if you rip up a law, when you physically destroy the paper that the law is written on, you abolish the law, right? And that's one reason why sometimes throughout history, you'll see in these popular or mass protests or revolts or mobs they'll burn down courthouses because the records were kept there. And when you burn down the courthouse and you burn all the records, then that means all of your debts are annulled. The land deeds, the title deeds to land, are annulled, so you can take your neighbor's property, right? And so this is kind of the idea. This is the view of law that has existed for a very long time, where you rip up the law, you abolish the law. Not to borrow a quote from, a misinterpretation of a quote from Paul, but I realized that kind of in hindsight. Anyways, so we find that Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai and Rabbi Eliezer ben Yosei, they rip up this law and they assure some protection for the Jewish people. And remember, Antoninus Pius did this because these rabbis healed his daughter. And what exactly they healed her of, I'm not sure. But she had something worthy of Antoninus Pius, a Gentile pagan emperor, to call on the expertise of these rabbis. There was also during this time, if you remember, the Sanhedrin had to go into exile, and they couldn't meet because one of the laws, or one of the provisions of the laws that the Romans had passed, was that you can't have a large meeting of Jews because, of course, that you're only going to cause trouble, right? You can't be up to anything good. You must be up to something bad, right? And so there was a relaxing of these laws, and so then you started seeing this sporadic reconvening of the Sanhedrin at Usha and Yavne in Galilee, right? So we find that, kind of like what we talked about last time, the Sanhedrin had relocated to Galilee, and they kept having to move, and it's for various reasons, but in part because of this persecution. What else is interesting is that Antoninus Pius provided protections for Christians, right? So we still see this connection between Jews and Christians, and no hides are caught in the middle, or closer to one side or closer to the other side. And so we still see that there's not been a total parting of the ways, because they're still seen as being similar enough. Antoninus Pius also had a personal friendship with Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, Judah the Prince. And this means that he sought out spiritual and worldly advice from Rabbi Judah Nasi. And we find this documented in Avodah Zarah 10. Also, Judah was responsible for compiling the Mishnah. And this is why this part is important, and this is how we're linking this to our lecture today on the Mishnah, Tosefta, and the Midrashim. Rabbi Judah was responsible for compiling the Mishnah, and he's friends with the emperor. So conditions are perfect for, kind of seizing the day, and, when it's kind of like, you get to the grocery store and it's pouring down rain, and then it stops. It's like, oh, okay, go, hurry, let's run inside, right? This is kind of what's going on. You just faced terrible, horrifying persecution. And now it's stopped. Now you have to make your move, because it could start up again soon. You just never know. And so this is why this is important. And so then also, not that you really need to know this, but just to kind of fill this up and finish it out, around 161, Antoninus Pius dies, and he's succeeded by Marcus Aurelius, who is probably one of the more famous Roman emperors. Him, Julius Caesar, Augustus, Nero, and Caligula are probably the top 5, I would say. Then after him, around 180, we find this guy named Commodus, which, if you've watched, Gladiator? I think that's one of the characters in Gladiator. But this is actually an emperor named Commodus. And he reigns for about 12 years, and then after him we find Lucius Septimus Severus, which, this isn't a Harry Potter character, it's another Roman emperor that comes after Commodus. And so this kind of finishes out the second half of the 2nd century. And we're not going to meet these guys again, at least in this PowerPoint, because they're not really that important for our purposes. But it just kind of goes to show there was a few more emperors after this. It's not like it just stopped. And I think it kind of personalizes the story here. Now, during the reign of Antoninus Pius, we find that Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel serves as the Nasi of the Sanhedrin. He's the prince, he's the leader. In modern Israeli Hebrew, Nasi means the president. He's the president of the Sanhedrin. And in fact, president is sometimes considered a better word than prince because the word sar, S-A-R, also means prince, so it can be a little bit confusing. So then after him, after Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel, we find that the office of Nasi actually goes vacant for a few years. And the details of that, it's complicated, it's messy, there's debating, there's trouble, there's people running around, it's complicated stuff. And so we're not going to be getting into that. But then after this period of a few years, we find Rabbi Yehuda Nasi serves as Nasi, right? This is where he gets his name from. Rabbi Judah the Prince becomes the president of the Sanhedrin, and he's really leading, can't really say he's leading Judaism at the time, because when you have Jews that are stretched all across the Roman Empire and beyond, even today it would be a difficult task, even with modern communication, Twitter, Facebook, Skype, 24-hour news. It would still be difficult today to run an empire that big. And so he had the most influence in and around Galilee, and then he had some influence beyond that. But what he does is going to be more influential than probably anything else that he did. And this is what we're going to be talking about. What we're going to be talking about is that he headed the effort to compile all the oral traditions that had existed within Phariseeism and very related streams of thought. Because, see, let me finish my thought. He compiled all these oral traditions and the Halachic rulings into what is called the Mishnah. Now I'm going to interrupt myself again. Basically, the Pharisees were it was a loose coalition of rabbis and lay people that had extremely similar interpretations. So this is why there's sometimes differences within, this flavor of Phariseeism versus that flavor of Phariseeism. That's why even in the Talmud you have Pharisees that disagree. This is why Yeshua himself, being a Pharisee or something that really resembled a Pharisee, debating with other Pharisees and saying you guys are stupid and wicked, because this is, for better or worse, whether you like it or not, this is how people talked back then. This was not, and it's not like you just hear it all the time out in the streets, but if you heard it, you might still be a little shocked, but it wasn't totally, completely unusual, right? Seeing a naked person out in the streets would be totally unusual. But hearing this kind of language, it wasn't that uncommon. What differentiates the Pharisees between the Tannaim, which are the sages that we're going to be talking about soon, is that not only does Phariseeism go from around the 160s, like from around the time of the Maccabees, up until about 70 or 80, around the time of the destruction of the temple, the Tannaim go from around the year 100 BC to 280, or BCE and CE. And so it spans a little bit longer, and the Tannaim are more scholarly. There's no lay people. And so, and it can be debated whether Yeshua was a Tanna, whether he was one of these Tannaim or not. I personally believe he probably would have been considered that if he had been recognized as a mainstream rabbi, but that's a different conversation for a different day. Anyways, so to say that Phariseeism turned into Rabbinic Judaism is not totally correct, but it's partly correct. And it's not like one person would say, I'm a Pharisee, and then somebody else would say, well, I can't be a Pharisee, I am a Tanna, right? Many Pharisees were Tannaim, but not all Tannaim are Pharisees. Does that make sense? And so the rulings of the Pharisees were passed on and included, but not necessarily all of them. And there's complicated reasons for that, which we're not going to get into. But if you're interested, you can always read more. And that's why I include the page numbers. Anyways, so the very word Mishnah itself means to study by repetition. It comes from the word shana, which means to study by reviewing. And it's connected to the idea of being secondary, right? It's the one that comes after. This is the idea, right? And so, unfortunately, then in around 192, Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi dies, and after him comes Rabbi Gamliel III, and he serves as Nasi after that. He reigns for about 8 years over the Sanhedrin. So then, a little bit of review, right? We've talked about this before. We've talked about this probably ad nauseum, and probably sick of it by now, but just to get it into our minds, right? It's like the dripping water faucet can wear away a rock. So let's drip a few times more, right? What does halacha mean? Halacha means it's the manner that a person walks, right? It's your gait. It's like, do you have a haughty gait? Do you have a humble gait? Do you walk humbly? Do you walk arrogantly? It's the manner that a person walks. And so when Yeshua says, I am the way, what do you think he's talking about? Follow my teachings. This is how you do Torah. It doesn't replace Torah. It's how you do Torah, right? It's be humble, be charitable, express chesed, be a chosed, be chasidic, love kindness and mercy and gentleness, right? This is what halacha means. It's how you walk. It's not the actual path that you're walking, necessarily. It's how you are walking on the path. So, for example, there's the commandment to rest on Shabbos, the Sabbath. There's the commandment to wear tzitzit. There's the commandment to, hear, O Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord is one. How do you interpret these things? What's written is what's written. That's the road. But how to interpret these is how you walk on that road. And so, just, again, a little bit of background. In Exodus 18, you can see the specific verses on the screen. Exodus 18 is the establishment of the Sanhedrin. We find that Jethro, suggests this to Moses, and then God ordains it, and he actually commands Moses to do as Jethro said. And he adds in some details after that Jethro didn't include. But anyways, this is in Exodus 18, and then, like I said, Numbers 11, the judges of the Sanhedrin are given the Holy Spirit. And if you don't believe me, go look it up. We're not going to read it, but go look it up for yourself. It's there. Deuteronomy 17, disobedience to the court incurs the death penalty. So you could be fined $100, and if you say, hell no, I'm not going to do it, then you just signed your death sentence and did something incredibly stupid and incredibly arrogant. So you don't want to say that, and you don't want to do that. In Matthew 23, Yeshua himself, Rabbeinu HaKadosh, our holy Rebbe, says to obey the scribes and the Pharisees, just don't follow their hypocritical behaviors at times. Right? So he's reinforcing this whole concept of the Sanhedrin and halacha and chazal. Chazal being the sages. So, again, what is the Sanhedrin? I think we probably all know this by now. Sanhedrin means court. It's the house of judgment, basically, and that's what Beis Din actually means. But it's where court cases are brought. It's the Supreme Court of Israel. And if I remember correctly, Sanhedrin is actually an Aramaic word, but it's referring to the same Supreme Court. It's just, again, different word, same concept, that goes all the way back to Moshe Rabbeinu. And what is the role of the Sanhedrin? Like I said, it decides court cases and issues rulings. It forms halacha. The location of the meeting. It met in the temple, in the chamber of hewn stone, but then when the temple was destroyed by the Romans, where do you meet? You meet wherever you don't die, right? You meet where it's safe. You meet where things can operate, at least kind of smoothly, and where you're not going to be captured and found out and captured by the Romans. The Sanhedrin was led by the second in command, the Av Beis Din, the father of the court, and was led by the first in command, the Nasi, which is usually translated, like I said, as prince or president. So the Nasi was on top, and his assistant, or you might call him the vice president in American political parlance, as his second in command is the Av Beis Din, which means the father of the court. So then who are the Tanaim? The word Tana means repeater. You're the one who recites. You're the one who recalls in your memory, what was ruled here, what was ruled there, what have I been taught, what is the proper way of doing things according to my teachers, according to the textbooks, according to class lectures and labs, right? This is the basic idea. They repeated or relayed, kind of like in a race, you're handing off the baton. This is the idea. They relayed the legal traditions of their forefathers till the present day. And that was, in their present day, it was the year 190-ish, around that time. And our present day is obviously, right now, as we're speaking and as you're listening right now. It is from the Aramaic word Tana, because remember, Hebrew was not the only language used in the land of Israel. You also had widespread use of Aramaic, and you actually had both of these languages used, and it's still debated to the extent of which either one was used, and in what contexts they were used. And you also had Greek spoken in the land of Israel because of foreign domination, because of immigrants, and so on. And you would have had a little bit of Latin used by government officials, but it wouldn't have been a widespread thing. But anyways, so both Aramaic and Hebrew were used, but in this particular case, Aramaic was being more used for maybe secular matters or things that happened outside of the Bible. So obviously the Tanaim existed between, like I said, 100 BCE, 100 years before Yeshua, and 200 CE, so about 200 years after Yeshua. And this is obviously after the time that the Bible was written, right? The last book of the Bible, Malachi, or Malachi, was written somewhere around 450 BC, right? Somewhere kind of around there. I forget the exact date, but it's somewhere around there. And so they're at least 300 to 400 years after the Bible was closed. And so this is just kind of the way that you communicate these things. The word Tanaim, the repeaters, the reciters, the people who recite from memory, it comes from the Aramaic word Tana and from the Hebrew word Sana, right? Basically the same word, which both means to repeat. Some famous examples, as we've kind of already discussed, are Hillel, Shammai, Gamaliel, who we all know from the Book of Acts, Gamaliel, Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, Yochanan ben Zakkai, Rabbi Meir, Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, Judah the Prince, etc. These are all examples of Tanaim. Before the era of the Tanaim, this kind of 300 years, as you can see from your screen, there was the era of the Zugot, which, this isn't totally correct, but just to kind of give you an idea, basically goes from the time of Ezra to 100 BC. So it lasted for a few hundred years, and it was actually right after the time of Ezra. But if you listen to our first few PowerPoints, you'll learn the specifics of that. So it was preceded by the era of the Zugot, and that then became kind of transformed into the era of the Tanaim that repeated the rulings of the Zugot, the pairs, or the duos, the dynamic duos. So Hillel and Shammai were the first Tanaim, right? They were the first reciters. Now this doesn't mean that nobody recited stuff before them. This is just the names, the titles that they're given. And remember, their teachers were Avtalion and Shemaiah. And these two guys were the last zugot, the last two pairs. Now, the system after the zugot was still pretty similar. You still had two rulers, the Sanhedrin, but one took precedence over the other. The Nasi took precedence over the Av Beis Din. So, then we have the question. Was Rabbeinu himself, was Yeshua, an unacknowledged Tana? Well, let's think about the requirements that we've already talked about. Did he live during this era of the Tanaim? Yes. Was Yeshua a scholar and not just a lay person? Because remember, you could be a lay Pharisee. I have no rabbinic training, but I could still be a Pharisee if I lived during that time. The Pharisees don't exist nowadays, so I can't be one today. But if I lived during that time, could I have been a Pharisee? Sure, I could have. Could I have been a Tana? Well, no, I don't have formal rabbinic training, right? Yeshua, given that he was called rabbi, it's believed that those who were called rabbi were those who had received formal ordination, which is shmicha. And in Hebrew, shmicha literally means authority. It's not ordination. It refers to ordination, but it literally means authority. You are passing down the authority. And so when it is said that he is one that teaches with authority, you could think of that as being he teaches as one with shmicha. And so those with shmicha are Tanaim. And so it goes to reason that Yeshua was actually an unacknowledged Tana. And so, kind of moving on from there, if you look at our timeline, we give some events that happened during the era of the Tanaim that are relevant for us as Nazarenes, as Notzarim. And so we find that Yeshua's teaching is smack dab right in the middle of this time frame. And so by studying those that came before and that came after, we can get an idea of, kind of get a better idea of what he's teaching, what he would have been doing, the culture and the context and the language and the religious context that he was operating within. And it also gives us an idea, like for example, when he's debating with certain Pharisees about a certain legal issue, we can see, well, did he agree with anybody else? Actually, yeah, Yeshua agrees with the Tanaim. And the people that he usually argues with, they were considered heretics by the Tanaim. They were heretical Pharisees, believe it or not. And Yeshua was actually a mainstream, he had a mainstream Tannaitic view, except actually in many cases he took the, I don't know if I'd call it the stricter view, but the beyond the letter of the law kind of view. And by the way, this is a phrase that is used in Hasidut and Hasidic Judaism today, so I'm not just talking Christianity here. But this just kind of gives you a view. And as we can see, into the 200s, we start talking about the church fathers, and these are contemporaneous with the Amoraim, which we're not going to really talk about today, but we will eventually. So then what is the Mishnah? This is the whole point of what we're talking about. What is the Mishnah? Well, first example, it was compiled by Rabbi Judah the Prince, as I said, and it's a collection of all of the halachot that had kind of piled up over the years, and he wanted to put it into one place. Because this way, if there was another kind of genocide by another Hadrian in the future, another genocidal maniac, Hitler, if this ever happened, then you would have a record of all the education of the rabbis that would be put to death. And so this information wouldn't be lost. And so basically what this is, it is a written version of the oral law. So this kind of answers our question, why was the oral law written down, right? Some of you might know that there was actually a prohibition in the oral law that says, what was written will be continued to be written, and what was oral must be transmitted orally, right? And this is why this is one of the biggest controversies in all of Jewish history. since it was a break in tradition. However, it retained certain oral qualities by not including all the necessary information. So basically, they wrote down the bullet points. They wrote a bit of a record of what happened, but you still require oral instruction to interpret it properly, to fill in the details, and so on. So it did still remain kind of semi-oral. Yeah, like I said, if it was received written, transmitted written. If it was received orally, then it's transmitted orally. However, after the destruction of Judaism, the Jewish people, and Jewish leadership, this became a problem, like I said. It also, after all this persecution, it led to the dispersion and exile of the Jewish people, which means that they're even more scattered abroad, and it will be harder to lead them and to shepherd them, basically. It was harder to be shepherds, and so this was helping them to be better shepherds. It also helped establish legal authority, this kind of going off of what I said, over the diaspora when personal authority was impractical or impossible. Like I said, Rabbi Judah the Prince, Yehuda Hanassi, he had a lot of influence around him, in the area around him, but then the further out you went, it just became impractical. It was very difficult. In other words, it's easier to carry a book than to carry a rabbi, right? A rabbi might weigh, around that time, maybe 160 pounds. They tend to be shorter and skinnier and healthier than we Americans. But, in more ways than one, I guess. So it's easier to carry a book than to carry a rabbi, right? You can hide a book under your jacket. You can't hide a rabbi under your jacket, and you're bound to get caught. And it's impractical. It's not practical. So how is the Mishnah organized? Well, it's kind of like the Bible, right? The Bible has books and chapters and verses. The Mishnah has tractates and chapters and verses. And these tractates are organized into, I think, 6 orders where it just kind of helps you to further organize these things. It's like different sections. It's kind of like in the New Testament, you have the Gospels, the Pauline epistles, the general epistles, the pastoral epistles, and the book of Revelation, right? It's kind of organized like that. So then what is the Tosefta? Well, the Tosefta literally means addition. It's the addition to the Mishnah. The Tosefta contains beretot, which is plural, of bereta, which means external traditions. It's other stuff that they were familiar with, but they didn't include in the Mishnah. And so it still is about this all the same people. It's just it wasn't included in the first edition, basically. And it's also considered the first of many commentaries on the Mishnah. And it's believed that the Tosefta was actually, first of all, backing up, if the Mishnah was compiled by Rabbi Judah the Prince, the Tosefta was completed by the students of Rabbi Judah the Prince. And so just to kind of give you some historical context of that, this would have been happening in the 200s. So the Mishnah was finished being compiled and edited around the year 190, or maybe 191, but around there. And the Tosefta was completely finished sometime during the 200s. We're not exactly known, but we know it was around that time. Kind of like how we don't know exactly when the Gospels were written. But we have a pretty good ballpark. The late Tannaitic and post-Tannaitic writings. So basically the writings of the 100s, the pre-100s, the 100s, and then a little bit after the 100s. In the 200s. The Tannaitic period ended around the year 200 CE, and this was followed by the period of the Amoraim, which stretched from 200 to 500 CE. The Amoraim were responsible for compiling the Tosefta in the 200s and the Talmuds in the 400s. Remember, I said that there's 2, Talmud Yerushalmi and Talmud Bavli, and getting tongue-tied. The Yerushalmi came first, and then a few decades later you had the bigger version of it, the Bavli, and then after around the year 500, a few other tractates were written, but they weren't really considered canonical. They were kind of like apocryphal tractates of the Talmud. Anyways, so during this late Tannaitic period, there was these things called Halachic Midrashim. And they were mostly composed by the academies of Rabbi Ishmael and Rabbi Akiva, which we kind of talked about earlier. These were Tannaim. And these sought to show unity between the written and the oral Torahs. This is kind of one of their main goals. They sought to comment on and explain various halachot, various halachic rulings, and it sought to explain the scriptural basis for these various halachot, because people would ask, where are you getting these things from? When you say that that these words shall be a sign upon your arm and they shall be as frontlets between your eyes, why are you saying that this refers to wearing tefillin and strapping these things to your arm and binding these things literally on your head? Where are you getting this from? And the rabbis would say, here is our texts that we're using as the basis for our belief. So this is one of the functions of these halachic midrashim. These midrashim also included legends about biblical and rabbinic figures, and they sought to kind of add to the experience of teaching. They were teaching tools. And remember, legends are not necessarily true or false, but they're passed on and they're taught for a specific purpose. Maybe it's to teach a good moral, right? And this, students, is why you shouldn't lie, because bad stuff happens. Or this is why you need to be stringent about keeping Shabbat or giving charity or something, because bad stuff will happen if you don't. And so these are really just teaching tools. And they weren't fairy tales. They were more concrete than that. They were believed to be true more than fairy tales. But it's kind of a relatable thing that we can kind of compare them to. Anyways, some example of these halachic midrashim are the Makilta of Rabbi Ishmael, the Makilta of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, the Sifra to Numbers, and the Sifrei Zuda. And there's so many of these. I just thought I'd kind of give you some names. If you're interested, you can look these up on Google. And that just kind of gives you a survey of this topic. Lastly, I wanted to cover what were the impact of the Mishnah, Tosefta, and Midrashim on both Judaism and scholars, because I know that we're running close to our time here. In terms of the impact on Judaism, for the rabbis can consult a consistently transmitted tradition, so there is this consistency where they know, okay, this is actually what was taught. This is the record of our tradition, right? If somebody says, "Oh, well, you guys are just making this up," they can say, "No, we're not. This has been around for hundreds of years." So this was a benefit to them. They can also compare notes better. They can say, well, I was taught this, this, and this, and then they go check the Mishnah, and oh, well, I was a little bit mistaken about this, right? It gave them something to check against what they were taught. And also, if two rabbis had two differing opinions, they could resolve issues by just go look at the text. It also helped to spread and standardize various practices and beliefs so that everybody could be on the same page, we could all be united. And remember, Yeshua says what? Your unity and your love for one another is how people will know that you're my disciples, right? You're the lovers, not the fighters. And people are going to know that, and they're going to be like, oh, you must be a Nazarene. Now, unfortunately, this isn't how it turned out because, there was two huge wars, and many of the Nazarenes were killed or dispersed, or unfortunately, some of them became crazy heretics. And as for the Gentiles, they kind of went off in their own direction. But if we had actually followed Yeshua's advice, this would be the case. And so this was actually one of the goals of the Tannaim and the Amoraim after them, is not to follow Yeshua specifically, but to follow the same ideals that he was setting forth. And also, just being realistic here, it teaches Torah better. These texts help teach Torah better. And so, whether you believe them or not, they set the standard the same for everyone. There's no unequal weights and measures, so to speak. Everybody's on the same page, and we build on from there. That's the whole point. As for lay people, they can double check their rabbinic authorities, especially when Rambam's Mishnah Torah comes out, which is a commentary and it's almost kind of like a version of the Mishnah, but we'll be talking about that later. Basically, he compiles all of the rulings and cuts out all the debates. Also, the lay people can reference the debates, decisions, etc. without having to constantly bug their rabbis, right? So the rabbi's sick, or they're on vacation in Hawaii, which hadn't been discovered yet, then they can go directly to the Mishnah and say, I wonder, at 2 o'clock in the morning, let's go in the synagogue and read the Mishnah. Because, everybody does that. The impact of the Mishnah, Tosefta, and Midrashim on secular scholarship. Not only secular scholarship, but scholarship throughout the ages and also modern scholarship. Historically, it helped in the compilation of the Talmud, which the Talmud is a scholarly work. It was put together by basically academics, by religious academics, and they all put their 2 cents in, or sometimes their $5 worth in. Some rabbis have a much louder voice in the Talmud than others. And this resulted in 2 different Talmuds where they're basically the same, but there's a little bit of different information in both. And as you can see, the dates are included in parentheses there. And also, it helped it's responsible for helping the Rambam, Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon, to draft his Mishneh Torah. And what the Mishneh Torah is like I said, he gives you the plain sense. What do I gotta do? I don't care about all these debates. I don't care what this guy said and that guy said. Just tell me what to do. And that was a revolutionary text in its own right. And if you want, you can go on to chabad.org, CHABAD, and they should have that text for free, along with some other cool resources. So if you're interested, you can find that there. For modern scholarship, it helps us to accurately understand ancient Judaism, because we don't have to guess, hey, are these rabbis telling the truth? We know if they're telling the truth because we can go all the way back to the year 190 and say, oh, well, here it is. If somebody makes the claim of Yeshua wasn't a human being, he was an alien, or he was a lizard person, according to the Gospel of Mark or something, then you can say, no, it wasn't, and we can prove that because the word lizard person is nowhere mentioned in the Gospel of Mark or anywhere else in the New Testament. And that belief can be proven wrong. So basically, it helps us to fact-check certain claims. It also helps us to contextualize the New Testament, simply because the New Testament is right in the middle of the era of the Mishnaic sages, the Tannaim. And so, not only can it help contextualize certain events or certain debates, but also the use of certain words, like Sabbath day's journey. The phrase Sabbath day's journey is nowhere in the Bible, but we see the apostles abiding by this. Also, when Yeshua is about to break bread or drink wine, it says that he says a bracha, a blessing. Well, what did he say? When you read the Mishnah, it says, when you are about to eat bread, for example, you are to say these words, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam hamotzi lechem min haaretz. Blessed are you, Lord our God, King of the universe, who brings forth bread from the earth. Right? Are these the exact words that Yeshua said? Well, actually, probably. It doesn't actually tell us, but he would have said something at least very, 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 very similar to this. And so, because, again, saying a blessing before you eat is not in the Bible. It's not commanded by God. explicitly in the written Torah. It says to say a blessing after you eat, but the sages said, we're going to say a little one before we eat, and then we're going to say, the real one, or the mandated one, after we eat, because we want to show God that we're extra thankful beyond what He told us is the bare minimum. And so in Yeshua's day, He was going above and beyond. Nowadays, that's just standard practice. If you didn't do it nowadays, people, Jews would think that you're, not very righteous. That's a whole other issue, though. These texts help provide us with a paper trail and document the antiquity of practices and beliefs, kind of like I said earlier. It can also help explain later developments in Jewish, Christian, and Islamic social, political, economic, cultural, and military histories. If that's too much of a mouthful for you, if you're wondering how that's the case, we're going to be getting into that later. So, around the 600s and 700s, when you really see Islam emerging, we're going to be talking about the Judeo-Christian roots of Islam. If you think that sounds crazy, well, just wait around and we'll talk about that from a scholarly, mature, and civil manner. So, I know that we're starting to run late. So then here is our conclusion. After the revolt of Bar Kokhba, or Bar Kosiba, so after the year 135, violence against Jewish leaders and the Jewish nation rips out because of Emperor Hadrian, and just things get very terrible. Like, if you remember from our story earlier, they're plunging these spears into rabbis just because they're ordaining the next generation of rabbis. This is how crazy things were getting. There was also the impending destruction of the Jewish nation and Judaism itself, and possibly even all biblical religion and knowledge could have been wiped out. Now, we know that it wouldn't have been wiped out in the entire world, but at least in the Roman Empire. And that would have been a massive, incomprehensible setback. We can't even imagine what that would be like. The Tosefta, which was written in the 200s, was an expanded version of the original Mishnah, and included notes, commentaries, and expansions of certain Mishnaic passages and ideas. The Midrashim helped teach Torah concepts in new ways, and they were basically educational tools to help elaborate on and explain and to teach the principles set down in the Mishnah and Tosefta. The Mishnah, Tosefta, and Midrashim served as important tools for Jewish scholars, and today they help modern scholars of Second Temple Judaism, like you and I, and they also help elaborate on and kind of enlighten our view of early Christianity as well. And so this is my takeaway from this lesson, and hopefully this is at least part of your takeaway. Hopefully you've even taken away more and things that I've not realized and that I've not found. And so if you'd like, leave a comment down in the comment section below. Give us a thumbs up and a share, and subscribe to our page if you're interested in these kind of lectures. And as always, remember to be Hasidim. We'll see you later.